Alright everyone, if you have spent any time looking through the material for Chapter 7, you're probably aware that the way this chapter works is that the book just goes through and has kind of a brief discussion of a whole bunch of different potential sort of network exploits that you can use as a penetration tester. Now, some of these are things that are sort of vulnerabilities in a protocol that's used over the network, and some of these are vulnerabilities for computers that are using those protocols in some way. And the book just sort of lumps these all into the same chapter. And so what we're going to do, there's a bunch of information in here, but there's really no big concepts to explain. So I'm going to go through and just kind of briefly mention each one of these things, and hopefully this won't take too long, which I know is something I usually say before recording an extraordinarily long video. So we'll try not to do that this time, and we'll just get right down to it. So the first thing that the book talks about here is this something that's referred to as VLAN hopping. Now, there's a couple different ways that this can be done. And the book kind of gives a brief example of each one. It can be either switch spoofing or double tagging. I think probably the thing that is easiest to understand is double tagging, and so that is going to look like this. This illustration is on page 226 in your book if you were following along. But this is both of these VLAN examples sort of are more networking things than I'd prefer to get into in this class. If you guys go through the Cisco classes here at Calhoun, you'll probably talk about the information that you would need to understand exactly how this works. If you haven't been through that already, just kind of understand the basic concepts, and then expect that it'll be covered in a little bit more detail there. If you're doing double tagging, it's a way of sort of constructing a packet in such a way that it is tagged for the VLAN that you're on and the VLAN that you're trying to get to. And so, depending on how routing is set up at the company that you're trying to penetrate, this may or may not work. But that's sort of the general view from 30,000 feet. Switch spoofing is a little different. This relies on making the attacking host act like a trunking switch, and if that's not something that makes sense to you, then just put that on the back burner for sort of a discussion that we're going to see in the networking class. Now, both of these can be sort of simulated in Kali, and so I'm going to show you guys sort of really basic how to launch this program. There's a program that the book mentions that it says is included with Kali called Yersinia. I believe that's how that's pronounced, and it actually was not on my copy of Kali. So if you want to put this on your copy of Kali, if you can do an apt get install Yersinia. I just did this, so it's not going to actually install anything. But if you're connected to the internet, that's what this would show. And now you can actually launch Yersinia. So it's just Yersinia like that, and it tells us that if we want to display the help file, we can do a Yersinia-h, and if we do that, gives us a couple different options here. We can use this on the command line, but if you want to use the GUI, you can do Yersinia -G. It shows us that we can use the graphical mode up there. And when we do that, this is, I have to spell Yersinia correctly. And if I do that, we have something that looks like this. This is actually pretty similar to the screenshot that you see in the book. But that's how you would launch this if it's something that you wanted to do. Yersinia is supposed to do both of these kind of attacks. Getting into the weeds of that is a little bit beyond what we're going to do in this class, but be aware that if that's something you want to mess around with, that's how you would do it. So let's go ahead and get back to this and then take the next example here. The next example that the book talks about is something called DNS cache poisoning, and what this has to actually there's a brief discussion of network proxies that happen between the VLAN hopping and DNS cache proxies. That is allegedly pretty simple to set up, but it depends on you having a proxy server. So if you're trying to do this from Kali, There's just one command to do it, but it's asking you to connect to a proxy server, which, if you're anything like me, you probably don't have on your network. So the command that you see in the book is probably not going to work. Okay, on to DNS cache poisoning. DNS cache poisoning is not something that frequently works anymore. There was a big vulnerability that was discovered in DNS about 12 years ago, and it's pretty has been fixed on pretty much most DNS servers that you're going to find out there. And so this is not something that's done anymore, not commonly. There's the book on page 229, and right here has an illustration of how this works. The general idea behind this is that if you are able to get somebody's DNS server to give them incorrect information, you can probably redirect network traffic to some server that you control. So if you can imagine that you get into somebody's DNS server and you tell them that the IP address for something like Facebook is a server that you control, and then on your server you build a web page that looks like the Facebook login page and says, hey, you need to log in. This would be a way of tricking somebody to giving you credentials for whatever site you're imitating as a result of being able to sort of manipulate their DNS. So that's what that means. Now, man-in-the-middle attacks. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of man-in-the-middle attacks. Conceptually, anytime that you have a computer that is sort of standing between two other computers, and information that is being sent back and forth between the two computers is going through the computer that you control or the computer that you've compromised in some way. This is referred to as a man-in-the-middle attack. There's a couple different ways this can be done, and there's a couple sort of different styles of man-in-the-middle attacks that exist. The first one that the book mentions, and we're on page 230 now if you're following along, is called ARP spoofing. ARP, if you haven't been through the networking class yet, is the protocol that's used to map the IP address that your computer is given to the MAC address or the hardware address that, in theory, is burned into the hardware and cannot easily be changed. So that relationship that maps the MAC address to your IP address is something that certain kinds of network equipment will depend on in when they decide to route traffic in certain directions. Now, that's sort of 30,000 foot view that would probably make anybody that's been through the networking class say, well, you're glossing over a lot of stuff. Yeah, I'm aware that I'm glossing over a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of stuff that you should probably know about the layers of hardware addresses and IP addresses and where those go, but that's not really in this class. For what an ARP spoofing attack would be is a way of, if you're able to get to a network and inform the network equipment that your ARP, that your hardware address or your MAC address is the address of something else, you can probably get traffic rerouted to your computer instead of to where it's supposed to be going. That's the general idea behind this. Now, your book mentions again a command that exists in Kali that it refers to as ARP spoof. And if you type ARP spoof, well, even if you type it correctly, what you're going to see is that this is not something that exists on your version of Kali. And I tried to do an apt-get ARP spoof, and I didn't see that working. I think this may be a deprecated sort of command, not in existence anymore, at least on the version of Kali that we're using in class. If you type ARP and then hit tab a couple times, though, it will give you a list of the other commands that allow you to manipulate ARP tables or view ARP tables or change ARP settings, or some other things that you can do with ARP. If that's something you're curious, you can take a look at the man pages for any of these commands. And if you are curious how you can get ARP spoof running on your Kali Linux box, that would be an interesting project to try. But I'm not going to try to demonstrate that during this video, lest this turn into something that's much longer than it already is. So let's go back here. This is an example of how an ARP spoofing attack is going to work. Pretty much what we were talking about earlier. So replay and relay attacks, we're still talking about things that are types of man-in-the-middle attacks here. These are replay attacks are things that it focuses on capturing information and then resending data. Relay attacks this sounds very similar, but the thing that makes a relay attack different is that there's absolutely no modification of the traffic that's intercepted. With replay attacks, it's a little less clear and a little bit more ambiguous if information is being modified or not. Replay attacks are getting sort of harder and harder to manipulate. They sort of depend on unencrypted protocols being used, and that's becoming more and more rare, especially in most commercial environments. I don't think there's too much else we need to say about those. Replay and relay attacks are pretty similar. The last there's a couple other. We're still in man-in-the-middle attacks, and one of these is referred to as SSL or TLS stripping. The book differentiates this between what it calls SSL stripping attacks and downgrade attacks. These are both sort of similar. Here's how they work. If you have ever gone to a website and you have, like if you go to Amazon right now, even if you just type in Amazon.com, then you go look at your browser bar, you probably have gone to HTTPS www.amazon.com. It has an S in there because it's using a secure protocol. That using of SSL and the encryption that SSL uses is something that depends on the computer on both ends and the way of the traffic's being relayed in the middle. If you have something, a man-in-the-middle attack could modify the network in such a way that your computer goes from using HTTPS to HTTP, at which point the network traffic is not as secure as it was when you were using HTTPS. That's what the book describes as SSL stripping attacks. It's not really an accurate term. The other one is that refers, but it's what everybody uses, so that's what the book calls it. Downgrade attacks are pretty much the same concept here, except that's sort of specific to using TLS handshakes. So there is a demonstration of what that looks like here. So, and I think the last thing that we're going to talk about for this sort of short of little video here, at least I hope this is still short, is what's referred to as a NAC bypass attack. Network NAC stands for network access control, and this is something that's used in a lot of commercial environments to sort of control how things are manipulated on the network. And if you're going to try to sort of illicitly access a network that is running NAC, you have to figure out how to sort of bypass it in some way. The specifics for how we would actually bypass that are a little bit more involved than what we want to get to in this class. One of the things that this will depend on you having is a different MAC address, and the book in a couple of these different attacks, in this one, and then I think also which one was it? I think it was ARP spoofing. Talks about something that can be used to change the MAC address of your hardware. It doesn't actually change it because the MAC address is burned into the hardware, but it simulates a different MAC address, and that's referred to as MAC changer, and that is something that should be installed on your copy of Kali now if this is something that you if you want to go mess around with. So Mac changer -- help would be a great place to start. And this would let you actually change your MAC address. And if you did this on a computer that was on a corporate network, you could use this to try to spoof somebody else's address. That's going to be something that's good for any sort of ARP attack, or that's also something that could be used for NAC bypass, either one. All right, so that's the end of this video, and then we're going to get into denial of service attacks next.